Today we're studying Genesis chapter 1, verse 2. We're using a translation called Young's Literal Translation, or YLT for short. I like to use Young's Literal Translation sometimes because I just get different results than if I use NASB, which I typically use, or NIV or ESV. And today, the translation from Young's is a little bit closer to the original text. To review, we have in the beginning, and beginning is the name of the book of Genesis, both in the Hebrew and in the Greek and Latin. Gods, and that's Elohim, the plural of majesty, preparing the heavens and the earth. So Young interpreted this as, not as in the beginning God made the heavens and the earth, but in the beginning, this is God's making of the heavens and the earth. The following account is us reading that, and I think that's probably pretty accurate. Heavens literally means skies. Earth means literally the land, the places of the world that aren't water. We're not talking about a globe here. Now that land hath existed, waste and void. All right, so waste and void. What's interesting is that in the Hebrew, this is a word play, tovu avohu. And what that means is, well, you have the idea of waste. And this Hebrew word, tovu, is a little bit more so like wild. It's not tamed. So we could imagine if I'm living in a agrarian society and I'm like a shepherd or something like that, and I go out into the desert, and then the sheep there, they aren't tamed, they aren't domesticated, they're crazy, they're wild, they're absolutely insane. Look at those crazy eyes. That's a crazy sheep right there. It's absolutely nuts. And there's no human cultivation there. And so the land, in the Hebrew imagination, it wasn't as if nothing existed. They didn't have that concept of nothing existing. It was much more so that it was wild, that no one was there to tame the land. And we found out that not only was the land itself or the world wild and untamed, it was empty or void. That's why I get in so many modern translations, the world was formless and void. Void meaning desolate, empty. You can imagine sort of a desert-scape with, cactuses and bushes and tumbleweeds and whatnot. But even then, in this interpretation of Genesis 1, chapter 1, the Hebrew interpretation, the original interpretation, this is a frightening image. There are no animals. There is no cultivation of the ground. In fact, the land back then had nothing on it, and it was wild and untamed, and there was disorder. And not only that, in their interpretation, the land originally was not the land, because we read that darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God fluttered on the waters. So in most ancient Near Eastern, and we're talking about Babylon and Egypt, etc., most ancient Near Eastern literature, the land, and that's what this line represents, was covered in water in the very beginning of time. They interpreted their creation stories as, the world was waiting to be brought up out of water, and then God showed up. Now, what's cool is that the interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, of the Old Testament, is totally different than most other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So, for instance, in ancient Egyptian culture, God, the creator God, because, they have most other cultures were polytheistic. The creator God sort of rises out of the water to start creating. He sort of creates himself in this cycle of self-origination. That's what makes them God. They originate themselves, but they have a beginning. In Babylonian myth and story, there is a dragon, and this carries over to Hebrew in certain ways. There is a dragon named Tiamat who is the waters, and she comes out, and she has to be slain by other gods in an act of violence in order to bring about the creation of the world. And that these gods are sort of the water at first. They come from that chaotic pre-creation. And Christianity is so different because we don't get an origin story for God. He always was, always will be. And the Spirit of God was fluttering on the face of the waters. And what that means, fluttering, let's start with there. Fluttering is a word used for chickens and birds, flying, floating, hovering. But the Spirit of God, let's nail this word down, truly nail it down. Spirit, you and I read spirit and we see an explicitly supernatural word, something that indicates unseen realm, something that is intensely religious, this word. Not so for Hebrew. The word in Hebrew is ruach, and it means a few things. The most basic meaning is wind or breath. But, based on context, we might be talking about a person's inner breath or the wind that fills the earth with life. In other words, this is sort of like invisible, alive life. In the sense, it's spirit in the sense of it's animated, it's real. It's not something that you can see, but it's something that has an effect on the world around us. So, this spirit is the wind and the breath, the invisible life source of God. And the original phrase then is not Spirit of God, but Ruach Elohim. The same God who's going to make or prepare the heavens and the earth, his spirit, his Ruach, is floating over the surface of the deep. And this is a sign for Yahweh, our God. And that's sort of like resembling his spirit hovering over the waters. He's transcendent of them, above them. He is not from them. The breath of God, the wind of God, that's the agent of creation. And so already we have some interesting stuff. We've already learned a lot here. One, we've learned that waste and void are very unique terms in Hebrew, and they mean waste. Instead of waste, you have tovu, which can mean chaos, and void means more or less emptiness, or, it's used in context more as a lack of cultivation or creation. So one alternate translation that I like a lot is wild and waste, because it rhymes. It has an alliteration, kind of like tovu vohu rhymes. This has an alliteration. It works. The earth hath existed wild and waste, and darkness is on the face of the deep waters, and the Spirit of God fluttering on the face of the waters. So the pre-creation in the Hebrew mind is a deep, submerged, chaotic space. Other cultures have stories of their gods coming from or being the waters. But our story has God above it all. The Ruach Elohim has put himself in place. He's transcendent over the waters, and now he will subdue them with his spirit into creation. And that is Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, reading the Bible the way it wants to be read.